Hello everyone, today we talk about the time dedicated to history in your lifetime. Of course, I'm a relatively young person, so I can't speak for something that goes more ahead than a few decades of existence. But a great part, at this point actually most of my life has been dedicated to history in a way or not. History, as we have explained far and wide in our Historian playlist, discussing this kind of more theoretical or just philosophical, because eventually it does get down to a practical expenditure of such knowledge, is boundless, right? You can't quite distinguish history in my favorite exception, that is properly the methodological one, not history as a story or history as, something that is written by specific people or just what technically happened. It's something in the past as a reality. I mean, properly the moment of the research, right, is something cognitively connected to our entire mental structures, evolutionary, and to such a deep core that you can argue that the entire point why we are here is somehow historical. In fact, in many ways, not just because we came to be through this illusion of time and in this kind of consequentiality that we managed to track and kind of inquiring as far as the cause and effect connection is concerned, but literally because our mental development derives from research, all right? And you can argue that there is an active purpose in this that is not just, a body brought there with some kind of consciousness and simply deciding at some point, okay, well, what do? I study history. No, it's something beyond, right? It gets down to what life basically gets down to. That is this constant capacity of expanding, which can only happen if there is an inquiry in the surrounding, a gamble and a struggle, right? So history encompasses practically the entire traditional values because it is just an act of faith. Right, you must have a reason to inquire the world around you because you want to carry out something. This naturally has major implications on the way we see history nowadays because the aforementioned exceptions rarely, even the methodological one, usually make reference to this. Right, history seems today, or has almost always seemed, in a sense, just like an activity carried out by a bunch of kind of well-off contemplative and sometimes even lazy people who just still sit on a chair all the time and that speculate on the outer side without even having much of a direct knowledge of the same. Naturally, part of this is true as much as the entire society has become, by a degree, this, right? You can't argue that even professionals in any other field are actually wired with what it takes to be a fully developed, complete, there's never the full list, of course, that would be even transcendental in practice, but let's say to at least some degrees that were, if you look at history, and we have observed it many, many times, still had kind of a more comprehensive awareness of the necessity to learn history as a history of everything, right? At least a history of everything human, because also, frankly, what would be science? The purpose of science in this sense, if it was not instrumental to us, right? If we, if a certain, in fact, physical dimension didn't have an actual influence on us, or at least if we wouldn't be able to perceive that, and surely there is plenty of stuff out there also in the realm of the physical world that we haven't in fact sorted out, and we're talking specifically about material issues. Why? Because it may have even come at us already, but not to the point that we would necessarily care about it. And there is even here a deeply traditional concept about this, because a great problem in the way history is approached today is that it's been despoiled of that sense of meaning, right? It's been kind of brought down to the level of some kind of parascience, as far as at least the narrower concept of hard science is concerned. That is to say, history is even, a matter of debate, not much because, everything is a matter of debate, and surely something so extremely more complex, mathematically speaking, than basically everything that we managed to sort out in a laboratory. But because in this sense, it's somehow deterior, right? So it's as if humanity had not actually been interested ever more in sorting out history, especially from an individual point of view, because you can also study history extensively, way more than the past. This is the case today, but not really getting to the point of it all, right? And that's why I always complain about hyper-specialization, the fact that nobody talks to one another, that properly the concept of synthesis, of comprehensive view, of even starting from the general and getting to the detail, right, exists anymore. And so history has become sort of a hobby for many people. I also have met, naturally, through my career, lots of historians and lots of would-be historians, or people that maybe wanted to be but never quite became some, and or that stopped at a bachelor, or stopped at a master, right? Some even stopped at a PhD, or maybe they haven't stopped yet, but that have taken that path, right? They have gone down that direction that fundamentally makes you a little oven, right? Producing little papers, very well articulated by a degree, but extremely narrow, even in the same kind of wide dimension of your hyper-specialistic field is, just to essentially survive economically. That is a huge issue. You cannot take it out of the equation. It's obvious that history nowadays, at least in the way it's done, doesn't pay much. And people, generally speaking, seem intimidated by, say, more complex history, or something that at least challenges their beliefs, or something, at least their false beliefs most of the time. And because it exposes not just the complexity of history. And so what you should be able to know, if you even wanted to have a minimal hope to be, say, relatively cultured about history, but the fact that that amount of knowledge, once sorted out by some satisfactory degree, is fundamentally pointing at you and saying, look, that you haven't basically done anything about your life. And not for the usual idea of look at the great figures of the past and compare yourself with that. That can help objectively, and there is a lot of iconoclasm in our culture, because we think that everybody who came before us, or even some person, great characters, etc., they were always some kind of evil bastards, megalomaniac, kind of egoistic, bombarded, say, the wars that, say, exchanging individual power in the real sense with, this guy was just, who was thirsty for power, right? What's wrong with being thirsty for power, right? What's wrong to have and to seek and to succeed in having power in the first place? That's already something that really nobody explains. It's like when people come up with that bullshit that there are too many people in the world, which is notoriously false, because there is more than enough resources for a much greater number than any of the 7 billions that are present here, and notoriously for any person who has ever studied demographics, world demographics, and or food production. So it knows perfectly well that there is plenty of resources. It will stay like that, and that at best they are just poorly distributed by a degree. And just the last decades have proven that there have been dramatic advancements just in life quality and all. But that kind of thing, right? I will not make children because there are too many people in the world. I mean, that means that, again, you are objectively, from a mental point of view, an underdeveloped person. There is no way around that. There is no a radical moral subjectivity that will ever make you, in reality, a developed person. The same goes with people that think that the world will end tomorrow because of climate change or whatever. There is the science of it doesn't say that, right? Not the science of a fringe science. Like the entire global scientific community consensus does not say that, right? But people are paranoid, and they're false, and they're weak, and they're evil, and they're stupid fundamentally, because they perfectly know they're lying, but they essentially destroy themselves with these theories because, say, the lower you bring the standards of the collectivity and the less of a person you realize to be. And this is essentially this tactic. It is happening everywhere, right? The same reason why people don't make children anymore, the same reason why there is no traditional standards. It's not that, we have achieved a moment in which we can finally be free from some strange constrictions that existed in the past. No, we have simply chosen to abandon any kind of standard, that is to say, any kind of duty. And believe me, when a duty is not fulfilled, you can ask for rights, you can even get them, but they will remain just on paper, because rights and duties do not go separated, right? In reality, for every duty you have a right, and vice versa. If you just take out one of the two, you cannot have the other consequentially. In reality, this could get down to literally the principle of dynamics. This is not a matter of personal opinion, and this is also what we have to teach people. There is, a level of scientific understanding in front of which the value of personal opinion asymptotically nullify, right? And great part of tradition was, in fact, based exactly on this realization, even with the relatively poor scientific means of the time. And simply they had it outlined for us. Hopefully, for the time, we would have sorted out, say, science in the materialistic sense that we have developed from this point of view by essentially crossing out the entire spiritual dimension. When, if we had crossed the two, we would have, a 10 per GDP in the world overnight. So the time to dedicate to history, in my opinion, has a lot to do exactly with this, right? Whenever we look at, say, what's your interest in history, sometimes you write me telling me, look, I'm not an expert, whatever, but say, and I didn't even suspect that I would be interested in some topics that you brought up in some of your videos that I suddenly was interested in. Historically speaking, I'm talking about, not necessarily these more theoretical ones. And this naturally means a lot to me because that's all what history is about in many ways. It's finding out that there is something to know. There is something out there, and it's not just a matter of, there's this curiosity, right? Of how many Facebook groups you can find out there with hundreds of thousands or even millions of people that post continuously just think like, completely ascientific data, like, did you know that this is this? And this is not even true, by the way, but it's such a simplified, cheap, small, simplistic, superficial concept that, again, that lesser person I was describing before will immediately feel like, this is for me, because it doesn't make me feel as stupid as I am, because it doesn't challenge anything about my poor intelligence. And that becomes addictive by a degree, and or it basically consolidates your brain the way it has poorly developed. Now, history, the time to history, to dedicate it to history in somebody's life is crucial in this, because there's really nothing more complex than history, right? Not even the universe, as it is today, is more complex mathematically to sort out than history, right? You can argue that, naturally, we study human history as something more contained chronologically. Nevertheless, right, if you were to analyze, at least if you put at the center of this equation life, which scientifically we haven't the palest idea of what the hell it is. And that seems a big deal because it basically revolves all around this. Again, without that, we wouldn't have science, because science as we know it wouldn't have any meaning, because the knowledge itself would be for no one. But aside from this, and all the various considerations that could be done even relatively to the point of connection of the spiritual and the material that we should also highlight in order to appreciate history. And today I'm not going to discuss that specifically. The idea of exposing yourself to historical knowledge is definitely the best service you can render to your own intelligence, right? If you truly believe that knowledge is power and that this power manifests itself in action, right? It actualizes itself in the moment in which you will simply start thinking, right, in a certain way. So not eating those little pills of silly curiosities with memes, but I'm telling you, literally training your mind to learn more and more complex things. Well, then you will unavoidably see how that thing changes you. Now, in somebody's lifetime, there are many ways one can learn history. That I approach the whole thing from, somehow professional background, and yet I make content that on Schwerpunkt, at least, that is designed for a broader audience. I think it's a trait of my personality that I simply like to even not necessarily paternalize, but I am fairly openly and openly patient towards people who want to understand. We don't have much of a dialogue here because I don't interact dramatically, mostly because I don't have time, right? But I often also answer questions, whatever I can answer. Most of my answers, revolve around essentially an explanation rather than providing you with data, right? It's provoking your thought in essence, and to start seeing things in a different, because that's what actually history all gets down to. When you're younger, you think that history is just learning a lot of stuff, right? And surely that is the age in which you should be doing that, because you're exactly designed to do that. That urge that you feel in that regard is, I don't know, I had my, before your mid-20s, right? Between your late adolescence and your mid-20s, you have this great sense of, inexhaustible thirst of knowledge, and you're fascinated, even with a kind of, idealistic attitude towards it. You are fascinated with people that know more than you. You tend to follow, to have a guide, in a sense to be also iconoclastic and extremistic, because all of a sudden you realize that you're building your own mature person, and you have necessarily to cut the ties with what you have been nurtured before. And very often, I tell you, after your mid-20s, you actually come back to the roots, because you would be surprised to know, in fact, how much the thirst for knowledge, especially in the earliest age, actually did bring you intuitively to understand things that in your early 20s you would reject, and that later on you would actually discover through knowledge, through studying, through hard work, that actually that previous concept was true, right? In your early 20s, mostly you have this sense that, everything is approximated, it's not quite the same thing. And it's actually a relativistic approach. It basically says, okay, yes, this thing is not 37% true, but it's, 35% true, and the 2% is so valid and meaningful. That is important because it makes you delve into details, right? It makes you understand how complex a reality can really be, and at that point you should surely be guided through some kind of educational path. I absolutely disagree with the neoconservative, allegedly conservative at this point, actually, idea that you should, after school, you should start just working, seeing how your life goes, and then maybe you start studying if you want to get somewhere. That's absolutely self-damaging in many ways. I know most people today don't quite do that, and I know that, again, people may need to work and may not feel to be particularly cut for a higher education. They may feel even to have been left behind. They may be complex even about their background. But believe me, the best way to fix a lot of things for the rest of your life is also studying a lot, right? Maybe studying and working, but studying seriously, right? Which it seems to me that even the people who fully dedicate to it without working at that age nowadays do not really meet the criteria of and the standards of, right? And the method, the necessary discipline and confidence and vision, whatever, right? For most young people, studying has become just sort of waste of time and money. There's no doubt about that. But the reason being the fact that their familiar backgrounds suck, their educational institutions suck, and so they properly don't see the point. They're just lazy. They don't want to work immediately. They want to hang out at university, whatever, and they just go for it. Naturally, there are lots of serious kids that, age up to be better, but let's say there are insidious threats regarding the aforementioned distortion of knowledge in general and history as we have defined it in a way that will lower the standards of everyone involved, especially if the average is particularly, inept, inadequate. Find a word that better suits it. Now, dedicating time to history is quite important. I think at least I don't have children following me, also because it would be illegal, frankly, and their parents should know better. So it's useless for me to give advice to them, at least in that regard. But for any parent, some of you said, I will. Now we have a child, my wife and I, and we know that he or she, I don't remember, would have been now will be educated with history, Christianity, and Schwerpunkt. Now that was quite flattering. And in this regard, I, of course, should point out that I don't make anything specifically pedagogic per se. And it's obvious that my everything I say here is meant at least for an adult audience of some sort. And I see that people from all ages actually follow me. But the concept being that children must, because children are the single most precious resource that we have. Like their brain is structured in a way that you can teach them directly and indirectly without oppressing them, of course. But what's oppression? That should also be defined by a degree. Lack of discipline and standards is, raising your children like grazing, making them graze like wild animals in out there. It's not really exactly how children should be raised, and that's how I remember from my childhood. Like most kids seem to be from everywhere, like pretty loud, undisciplined, spoiled, careless, and obviously, great part of the problems we have today, of course, derive from that, and it's always their parents' fault first and foremost. And there is properly, of course, no way to determine how their life will go. That they can take at some point, from their teenage, some paths that you may have not, you couldn't avoid, unfortunately. But there is no doubt, statistically speaking, that if children are raised in a stable household, especially with adequate parental figures, and they are properly disciplined and educated and properly acculturated, right? We will talk about this now, with adequate teaching, traveling, sporting, because that's all comprehensive, right? It teaches you to have ever greater strength to pursue a broader goal. And we all know that from our personal experience, how that affected us. The better, more successful, more mature, more stable people they will become, and the less civilizational, cultural cost they will have, right? So, naturally, we live in a world today in which the opposite is true. not because things have been dramatically better ever in a time, right? But the average person has always sucked by any cultural standard existed at that point. And it will likely stay like that. However, there are some core formal aspects of people's upbringing that are being collapsing in a structural sense, right? And so losing essentially the form that civilization was used to provide. And this is a pretty rare thing, that I'm very, say, Westernophile by a degree, because I believe that the highest standards are still met there, and that there is just a plethora of fourth estater peoples and culture that must pretend that since there is a crisis in the West, they are anything better, or that they will replace it or whatever. No, because the lower you are, the worse you'll become, right? If you don't have exactly what instead the West had and still has, to have been the most advanced civilization in the world from quite a while. So it's imperative, of course, to exploit, especially Western unspeakable wealth, to in properly the education of young persons, and to properly instill that sense of authority, discipline, order, hierarchy, rationality, exactly in that right balance that has nothing to do with any degeneration of this from one side or the other as an excess. And this is very difficult to teach, right? In a world that confuses, say, National Socialism for tradition, or that properly lacks the most elementary cultural compass to even frame history, to understand history. It's obvious. Just ask kids today what World War II was. At least we were grown old, as our grandparents fought the war. We lived in a world that, in a sense, was reminiscent still of that. People who had been there were still alive. We had a sense of order, discipline, of frame that, yes, derived from the nation state of the 19th century. We're still within that frame, even though significantly kind of adulterated. However, we had a sense of where we were coming from and where we were going. Nowadays, that compass is being scientifically destroyed exactly to cause a civilizational collapse. That even the people who were allegedly talking about, preserving, are actually disintegrating because of the aforementioned reasons. It is they haven't the palest idea of what the hell they're talking about. So historical knowledge and time for knowledge is important because it takes a long time to nurture, right? It wouldn't even be a matter of, let's say, of quantity, as we were saying before. However, we live in a time in which definitely fatigue, let's say, afford the sense that you should, progress is being properly removed, right? The idea is that whatever happens, first of all, is never your fault. You shouldn't feel bad about it. Again, somebody should fix the problem for you, and you should simply keep doing whatever you want, right? That's the aforementioned rights without duties. Except, in this way, the masses are sinking, and they're not even realizing that, and that's why they get angrier in a way, but they're also angry at the fact that they cannot accomplish anything, right? The ideal would be to have that compact community where more or less everyone has a satisfactory degree, in this case of historical education, but the same could go for scientific education, because the two things can never be eliminated, and that's why before I was complaining about, say, this bullshit of neoconservatism, they should just study economics or whatever, because humanistic faculties are useless, right? Of course, there are humanistic faculties and humanistic faculties as much as scientific faculties, and we cannot hide behind the fact that, in fact, standards are sinking everywhere. But again, there are differences, which is what moral relativists will never accept. It is to say that something can be bad, but at least there's something better and worse within it, because the world is complex and you can always do better than what you're doing, right? So very often this is taken as an alibi just to be an ignorant, right? At least I come from a country where the opposite is normally true. That is to say, if you're not schooled in humanistic culture, and even I, with my background, I have complexes about this, that as opposed to I don't know, not knowing maths or physics. I incidentally had actually in high school a more scientific bias than humanistic one by choice, and this turned out to be super useful even as now a full kind of fully humanistic backgrounded guy, because and I realize how powerful the synthesis, that kind of blend is, and why, like in the past, like in the traditional past, the true elite and the only possible elite, the people who governed empires, kingdoms, noble people, etc., were dramatically educated, first of all, in history and in other humanistic faculties and subjects, and in science as well at the same time. In other words, they were aiming at a kind of a know-it-all thing, and don't think that since knowledge was, say, relatively less, of course, at least stored and accessible and properly available at the time, things were easier, right? Because they learned much more, but really much more complexly, existentially, than what we do today, which is an incredibly narrow, claustrophobic, compartmentalized thing. So there would be all a problem in terms of, time dedicated to history, but together with what, right? Because as I was saying before, for example, traveling, which is something that you should be hopefully able to do since you're a child, and that, however, doesn't mean per se, because there is traveling in here. Now I'll explain the thing. It's necessary in many ways to picture essentially what the world is about. I must say this, not to make you feel bad if you, for example, couldn't afford traveling and things like that. I travel a lot, but if I were to trade those travels for all my historical knowledge of the same places that I learned, I wouldn't. I would actually have preferred to have never been there, but to have still studied the history of the places where I went. Right, and that I incidentally began to study. This is a double thread thing, of course, because I went there and I was fascinated with them, and I loved them, and they're part of me, and I believe that there is a universal meaning out there that is all one with that scientific knowledge, political awareness, historical education, and whatever, and that cannot be limited to just a thing, right? But if your traveling is, having, staying a weekend in a capital just to take a bunch of selfies in front of monuments that you don't even know what they are, and coming back and to post them on Instagram and pretending, say, I visited over 30 countries, yes, and you don't know a fuck about them. Well, that's not exactly the way people should travel, right? The ideal would be something like a Grand Tour, 17th century style, in the heart of Europe, as much as in other places. I've never left Europe. I've been literally tens of times abroad, but often, 15 times in a single country, aside from my own that I toured. I don't even know how many times. But let's say having a purpose that is the one of a comprehensive lifestyle. I mean, people want to visit places because of, lifestyle and cafes or whatever, right? They don't even suspect what is present in those countries, and first of all because they don't know anything about them, right? A great part of the reason why I also talk historically, for example, in that series about the historical regions, is that I want to show people what there is there, right? And what the history is there, showing the pictures of the places, of nature, of landscapes, of cities, of monuments, is crucial to, and many of them, right? Not just the single most famous ones, but let's be honest. Like, if you pick a pool of persons, and you the average person, let's put it in this way, and you even in Western world, and you tell them, look, these are the major Western capitals. Tell me anything about them, in terms of what are the most famous monuments, whatever. They will maybe name 2 or 3, and then they will not factually even know anything else historically about those cities or places, or even not just, this is valid for countries in general. That is the measure by which a person is historically illiterate, and it is a problem, right? Today I will not say, why that is a problem, because again, I explained it many, many times, but it's also evident in practice from the things I say and repeat, right? So I think travels can inspire this, even the wish to travel. There is a sentimental connection to lots of things when you travel, and this thing is going to stay with you. You build a sense of identity and community and literal visions. If you consider Europe is quite differentiated within it. It's always been the strength of Europe in itself. It's also the motto, actually, of the Union. It has, arguably, Europe would have not been what it was if it had been just a granitic culture, right? Granitic cultures historically always failed, right? They never even made it to higher spheres in the first place. Europe has this dramatic capacity of having a cohesive identity and spirit, albeit being substantially different from a place to another. Not radically different, in kind of global opposites within the same, but it trains you a lot to understand how far, for example, a universal imperial dimension goes, and how poor a nationalistic and socialistic one is, because the latter belongs to the weaker times of Europe, for the moments in which Europe was losing its primacy, as a matter of fact, and degenerated and destroyed itself, and for the obvious, of course, rejection of any trace of tradition, which these ideologies were born against, specifically against, and that, in fact, has nothing to do even with the actual different identities of Europe just per se, right? National identities in Europe have nothing to do with nationalism. And this is literally because people still do not know the difference between the adjective national and nationalist in their own language, right? Which is also pretty universal in the Western languages. So we have arrived to this point of radical under-education and consequently of radical personal underdevelopment. And this means that people are weak, empty, and fundamentally useless, right? At least in potential, they could be useless, but they will not be, and we know this statistically in front of our eyes. They're worthless people. There is no way around this. It's not being harsh. It's not being, it is being discriminatory, because discriminatory is a completely neutral term, but again, the lesser people have decided that discriminatory means to discriminate negatively against, right? So completely changing the actual meaning of words, because of course nobody knows etymologies anymore. Never mind, realizing again that there was a past, that words come with an actual legacy and semantic and proper fact system of knowledge from which the same languages were built in a spiritual sense. All this does not exist anymore. There is just the radical moral subjectivism of the lesser person that cannot afford anymore to understand anything, and therefore has to drag down the world to their squalor and inferiority and misery. This is the greatest problem that we have with people. And I think great part of the problem does stem from the fact that they don't know anything about history. Because history is politics, history is war, history is society, right? If you still have doubts regarding, which, generally speaking, what happened in the world, right? Who won, who lost, what are the most, or the more or the less advanced, what is going on? You are a confused person. You lack knowledge, and the most basic human instinct would be, if you understand the severity of the thing, and that's the problem, to actually fill that gap, to actually learn something, to actually know something. And this, again, has seemingly disappeared. The time to learn means that and I say this especially to my colleagues that stop after 3 years of history or 5 years of history and pretend to be historians and go out there and make their, fancy kind of internet curricula saying, I'm a historian, I study here. What kind of historian are you if you think that studying history stops to 3 years or 5 years, and then maybe just you work as a librarian, let's say, or in a bank, right? That it's fine with that. I could have become, as I was saying before, an officer or a doctor or an economist myself, but I knew at the time, as I'm sure of today, that I would have always learned history. Why I was thinking about going for those professions, where would I found the time for having always a history book in my hands, on my closet, on vacations even, right, while traveling or whatever? Because to me that was crucial, and it's always been, right? Besides this, I think, of course, the earlier you learn history, the better it is, right? You should understand around your already 15, 16 years old, preferably that should happen a couple of years earlier, that next to school there is also together with school there is your personal improvement, right? That's an important intellectual realization, that doesn't matter how much the institutions suck, there is still something to them that can be profitably exploited by you to improve yourself. This is to be seen as an opportunity, right? At the time, for example, I liked my high school. I always liked to go to school fundamentally, and I was also good in school, but I've never been like the top genius student or whatever. I was just considering essentially how well I should have been trained with what I was being offered there, and how much I could couple that with lots of other things. Also leisure time, for sure. However, this could come from simply knowing, right? I was curious about things. When I read, somebody made a reference, a professor talked about something, I wanted to know what's that author. I was fascinated, especially at the time with philosophy, but also with history, like what did actually happen and how should I be seeing history? I wasn't even particularly convinced that I should have studied history. Sometimes I thought about languages, sometimes I thought about, in fact, even other disciplines, but my intellect brought me, even though I'm not an intellectual, I think, and I never wanted to be one, really, that, let's say, being able to talk about a certain work and essentially extrapolating the deeper meaning of that, and being able to handle it, to toy with it, to kind of to titillate your mind with that, was a way to improve yourself, because I found out that I could simply do it. I remember that, for example, lessons, especially when I was starting like 16, 17, 18, are all stuff that I could study at home. I didn't need to listen to the teacher. I would simply read, right? I remember Don Quixote. It took forever to finish at the time, because also you can measure that, say that you grow, right? The time of history teaches you also how fast you can measure an improvement by the speed of your speed, right? It's obvious that the younger you are, and the more you have to get habituated to knowledge in some way. It's like when you're told, that as a kid in school you have just 20 minutes attention span, and beyond that it's just you're just say, oh my god, I'm so bored, and looking at the clock. Well, it happens, right? But in a sense, that there is also a moment of imposition that obliges you to understand that in theory there is a much greater result you can attain, right? I was always impressed in high school when, at the end of the year, we reviewed the program, because we had to sign with witnesses that professors that actually taught the thing, and we read all these pages, and looking at them, I was saying, look at that. If somebody knew actually all those things, and I still think it today, we would already have like a good, the equivalent of a master thesis. Right? Obviously, we all fell short of the expectations because eventually of those standards that are, at least what is interesting is that these programs were set in times where people would actually even properly learn everything, right? I wasn't there, say, in my parents' time to realize how different school really was, and I have my own ideas about that, but it's not time to digress. However, it's obvious that these programs were conceived organically, comprehensively. Like, there is a point where you should learn all this stuff and why you should really be able to, in fact, to master that. There are people who are simply not, say, I don't know how many, hard scientists follow my channel, for example. I know that there are, and I know that there are lots of people that with a scientific education that are extremely passionate with history, because probably they're fascinated, in fact, especially if they're good at their job, with the complexity of the system. And so they're fascinated by how uniquely the mind can summarize, kind of make a synthesis of the entire knowledge, because that's literally what happens. When you're young and you don't know enough, you think, again, that learning happens in a sort of arithmetic kind of cumulation, right? It's a quantitative process, and you have to keep things in mind, learning them by heart. Then when you start learning a lot of them, you realize that your brain is able to go in thousands of different directions just on the basis of what you are able to elaborate, that you have acquired. And so at some point you actually slow down. I mean, when you're 30, you're not like you're 20, and you realize that you're putting less efforts and times for what you could do. It takes a longer time, and most of the reason, of course, being because you are also able to provide with kind of better insight, better knowledge, right? It's not just that you're lazier tendentially, you're less hyped and kind of emotional and, I don't know, motivated, and you can easily perceive that, because working is hard. By an important degree, you do get worn out. There are moments in your life in which you can absolutely realize it kind of it tricks you, because it's slow, right? You don't realize from a day to another how much you can lose in terms of motivation. But at the end of the day, we're all going towards the end, apparently, and this manifests itself also in this sort of wisdom that you should have hopefully acquired on the base of how difficult it is to interpret a given information. That's also what, in fact, as the masses are not habituated to do anymore. That is to say, actually having a critical insight on things. We're not making a meme out of any information. So whatever you hear, you just switch more through more relativistic mode, and you interpret the thing upside down, denying reality and enclosing yourself further in your shell. Being full of doubts has nothing to do with the fact of also being full of knowledge and certainty and solidity, right? The more you go on with historical knowledge, and the more actually confident you become that what you're saying is correct. And this is not to say that everybody who does this is correct, per se. There is always a lot of miscomprehension, a lot of gaps. Again, given the way most historians are being formed nowadays, it's obvious that they're going to fill the gaps with ideologism. This is normal, and especially also young people do, because they don't have anything better. But at best, like, between people who really understand each other, the most complex thing to do, first of all, is sorting each other out, how they reason and what they know, and how they know that, and how much also they can express themselves. The time for learning history should entail not just you learning a lot of books and traveling, and I say traveling again because I think it's really important, especially in an early age, but beyond in general. But let's say for opening yourself to the world, for knowing how things really are, to see things where they are, and to breathe, because I think there is a mystical force in the nature of places and of communities and of people and of countries, that there is something like that. Even if you have to be there to really appreciate to the fullest, because it's inspiring and it's spiritually developing, right? But you should also be able to express yourself. In fact, that's the thing, that even if you can do it even with yourself, it's kind of risky, right? But for example, analyzing the situation, right? Assessing risk, also thinking out loud about an ideology that you have, and not trying to act as if you were right, to just training yourself to keep lying and fundamentally to twisting any reality, but to actually providing the right dialectical, in fact, say, it can be a method, it can be the way just you express yourself, just the data you provide, in which way you connect them, really teaches you how to just expand the complexity of your knowledge, so that, again, this won't be just about what you know in that specific instance, but you know that when you're presented with a certain amount of knowledge, when it's expressed in a too simplistic way, the first thing you want to know is more, right? You know what kind of questions you can pose to find out the thing. You can kind of unmask the person that is just selling you a slogan and is not really interested in making anything else. Like, the single most common really problem we have today is moral relativism. Really, it comes with ignorance. Again, essentially, most people are driven like this. They want something to be like they want, and so they build a parallel reality that doesn't match reality, right? And this is the most interesting thing about this, is that it happens from both sides of the aisle, right? You see, nowadays we think that if you are from one side, you're better or worse than the other. Surely there is something like that, but it's a morally relativistic thought if you don't understand that the average of both can be disgusting, right? You can even be better than another person, but still being a disgusting person. You know, didn't that occur to you? You know, if you own an idea. So given the polarization of opinions, that is absolutely normal. The most important thing is nowadays assessing how both sides lie openly on everything, and on topics they fundamentally cannot understand, right? They cannot understand because, again, if you don't have any specific expertise or, you know, background or whatever, putting together pieces from things you hear on the internet loosely is not an actually scientific information. It doesn't matter that your side of the aisle may be truer than the other. That surely has something to it anyway, because it's always the case. But this doesn't tell anything about how satisfactory that you're pushing for is valid or not, right? And a typical, say, there is, say, a pro and con of this, because as long as people behave like that, they're at least articulating something, right? They're in the investigation phase. They may still be kind of, you know, below standards and whatever, scientifically speaking, but they are in the moment in which they are testing themselves. I mean, when you present one theory, and for example, you want someone to validate it, right, or to hear their opinion on the thing, you are automatically posing yourself in the kind of student mode. You're seeking validation not just from anyone. Of course, if you think that kind of somebody is less than you, you will try that in a way. But when you are, say, submitting to someone, seeking for approval, attracting their attention, whatever, it's because you want to know whether that thing is true or not. And you literally go through phases when you actually meet someone who's telling you, well, that's not the case. Maybe they're wrong, maybe they're right, but at some point it will hit you. It will hit you that the thing you were thinking, that position you could have, that kind of reminiscence of simply of falsity, right? That you knew to be false, that you knew to be hyperbolic, that you knew to be kind of extremistic, that you knew you were essentially using, again, to fill an ideological void, is going to be suddenly substituted with actual knowledge. And a great problem in this all is that normally that doesn't happen until kind of a spiritual awareness is cultivated. I must say that in my life, as long as I didn't understand the moral dimension of history, right? So not just the materialistic, and that's why it's nationalistic and socialistic in nature, right? If you go by approximations, if you go by thinking that literally there is a immutable block or just a materialistic indicator, you still think that economics is the answer to things alone, that you can compare apples to oranges, because of course you don't even know that they're apples or oranges respectively, you can't distinguish them yourself, you will yet be insecure, because you will know that you're essentially betting on something that you're not sure of, right? And so you will question and again until you arrive somewhere. Now, I don't know how this thing actually works on the longer run. Of course, you meet dumb people, even at a very old age, that you realize they didn't do their homework that maybe you did when you were 16, right? And they're still stuck in, an infant mode, right? Because they literally haven't been there their entire life. So, in my experience, what I can check, at least from my background, from my titles of how I came to got them, is fundamentally that what is written by today's academic historical standards is overall correct, right? It may not be the whole thing, it may not be exactly the point of it all. There's still a lot to write, but substantially the core of that and the method and the principles and the kind of evidence that is used by, acceptable approximation is fundamentally correct. It is the civilizational equivalence of our current level of development. And in order to top that, you should, again, come with something that, is enormous in terms of moral and scientific work. In other words, you can't be the average idiot and thinking that, there is an evil elite that rules the world that wants to establish a global order, believing that and pretending that since somebody disagrees with that is ideologized. Because you are the one who is ideologized, and you do not understand that, or at least you perfectly understand that, but you think that from the other side there is a big conspiracy that is fundamentally oppressing you, and if you have the truth, nobody really understands why things should, simply not melt away in front of it, and that's where you haven't gotten properly to the traditional spiritual value, because if you even had known how this mechanism actually works, you would be able to see that your own delusions are essentially a superstition that you built over yourself, and that there is no doubt that things go wrong, there are lots of issues, terrible things happen for negligence, for criminal mind, there is a lot of stuff going wrong. But first of all history has been like that. Things are not going worse because there is somebody coming out of nowhere and suddenly imposing with magic tricks, the destruction of the world, while everybody obeys that, and you suddenly discover that, and that's it. The reason why things are going worse, if they are going worse, it's because you are the weak ring of the chain, and you are self-sabotaging yourself, Western civilization, its superiority, and destroying, in fact, all what is present in a traditional dimension that you cannot see, because you also you're, generally speaking, a socially envious person. You're, again, a frustrated, for some reason, right? You cannot accept that there is somebody above, right? And that's, in the entire traditional meaning, the greatest indicator of evil, of inferiority, of villainy, right? If you are superior, you automatically become, right? Because you're able to struggle through it and to make it. Destroying things doesn't mean to actually succeed, right? That's why you can have a civilizational collapse and pretending that who knows what was saved out of that, when it will always be remembered like a disaster where everybody lost, right? Not, somebody's yes and the other not, right? And that's why also history very often is misinterpreted in ridiculous ways, right? Again, in tradition, if you are superior, you win automatically. So anytime somebody loses, that opens a question that, first of all, if you were the better one, you you failed in the first place, and those who prevailed, however, prevailed over you. So again, it's a relative concept. Those people were better than you, but not necessarily better than what you could be, for example, or the opportunity that you had to make things better, right? It means that you didn't fight as strong enough, and it doesn't mean, it doesn't seem to me in any way today that for all the complaints about all the possible things going on politically, there is anyone more than, again, somebody behind an iPhone just ranting because they are frustrated about themselves, and because of that they're poorer, they're stupider, they're weaker, and they're never going to do anything about that, right? At best, even in situations of social collapse or whatever, they could be mobbed, let's say, to be blind violence and then being reduced in slavery, as it always happened, because fortunately the people never ruled in any country, thank God. And if you don't understand this very concept, you do have problems, and that's the entire point of why you cannot accept a hierarchy or an authority, and especially locating yourself in the organic system of nature, in the empire, in the God-given hierarchy of power. This historically speaking, is fundamental, because in other times and eras, right, the awareness that this was the case was limpidly out there for everyone, right? If you make a check test, right, you could have asked even a peasant, right? The Marxists came by saying that this was a sort of, problem of cultural hegemony, that basically also the peasantry was brainwashed into things. First of all, we don't know too much about what the peasantry actually believed, and what we see is that as soon as they were given room for more autonomy, they would seize that. But in no way, in the moment they seized that, they would think that derived from a kind of flat equality that nobody really even understand how to morally justify, right? Well, what's the point of things like closing the gender gap, right? Given that we know that there are radical neurobiological differences between men and women, what's the point? We are scientifically different. What's the point of closing the gender gap? If there is something wrong happening legally just on the basis of human rights, that's it, right? It could happen to anyone. You fix that and you move on. Forcing equality of outcome is not just communism, but it's one of the proofs of the single most radical mental inferiority that you can find under any profile, intellectually, properly, mentally, morally, culturally, whatever you come from. Also, that's very important. Your household, first of all, or lack thereof, as it unfortunately is, right? Most often the case. And presuming that everybody has to stick to your level, simply because you cannot afford to be anything better as a person. Nobody cares. And actually, other people have the right to step over you, right? It may not be a positive thing, but the problem is you, because nobody can fix the problem but yourself. You can be showered with welfare money, whatever, but if you are not capable of making an effort and structuring yourself, you will not know what to do with this stuff. And this happens also to rich people. And that's how civilizationally things change, and we are able to make things work in different ways, except this rule remains constant because it's simply rooted in physical reality and in moral reality, and it cannot be changed in any way. Reading is important, but it's not all. As I often said, reading doesn't mean understanding, doesn't mean learning, doesn't mean studying, right? Doesn't mean criticizing, doesn't mean teaching, by the way. Doesn't mean a lot of things, right? So you can read for a lifetime, not quite getting anything good from that, or at least in a relevant sense. And it depends also on what you read, right? If you are, again, against the concept of hierarchy, canon, classics, whatever, like, I wonder what kind of literary tastes you have, right? That's the same rule, in literature. If important works remained over time as such, because they were highly consequential, and maybe even you disagree with them or whatever, you have there exactly what resonated with the world to maintain it throughout. Do you have the palest idea next to, some of the greatest classics of ancient or medieval or modern literature, how many other works were written that we, by some degree, fortunately, will never hear of because they were just rubbish? Of course, we should know everything, and that's the thing that in your youth you should be set on. You want to know everything. You want to read everything. Before my mid-20s, I already had my library of over 10,000 history books, and my plan was, okay, let's do the maths and see, in theory, how much time would it take to finish reading them all. And then I realized, with great kind of sense of human limitation, that I will not die having read all those books. So it's as if you could picture there even the limitation of your own knowledge by a degree if you don't truly make an effort to know more. My, again, advice remains warmly, hotly, I would say, to read as much as you can from your teen age, especially. Also, as a child, it's very important. But it's important also to do other things. You shouldn't just be reading so much all the time. But say reading a book every day, even 30 pages in your teenage, every day, right? Just for it, and kind of reasoning on them, right? Not, let's say, as sometimes happen, I don't know, I've read a 500 pages book in one day, which I did arrive to do. But I know I remember very few about that. Of course, there are books which are... Finishing a book is important, right? I always felt... like a sin, like not reading a book. I think only once I actually even deleted a book. It was that from Graham Hancock, I think, about, because it was such just, I've read a random line and say, okay, I will never read this point because it's so idiotic that perfectly embodies the degree I was talking about before. Say, hijacking a completely misunderstood traditional knowledge, which you can find on any kind of history of religions book, to essentially fictionalize a sort of hippie anti-establishment bullshit about, by exploiting ancient, again, legends, right? With no method whatsoever, because journalists are not science people. Right, as a historian, I think journalists are good just at reading the news, and that's the only thing they should be doing. I mean, somebody else should write for them, and it should just be reading. If you want to have the cool person doing that for aesthetical reasons, I understand that on TV, but journalism should never be properly considered per se. In the absence of an extraordinary investigation or inquiry or something like that literally aims in that sense at knowledge, any kind of, in any traceable form, any form of reference, of authority, of competence, of expertise of any kind, right? And that's unfortunately what happens today. Most of the stuff you hear, they're not bad because they are from one side of the aisle or another. Right, you're not a hero if you say that, I don't know, that media says one thing or another and it's a lie, and you can think, oh my god, I'm so intelligent. That's not supposed to give you anything reliable in the first place, independently from which side of the aisle they are. What they do is they paste and copy some sketchy information, and they try to make a sort of little novel about that to balance out what they know in a very loose way. They don't have absolutely any expertise. Of course, they call up experts to talk and to say dimensional things that even, again, the average fourth essayer can minimally understand, because we arrive to the point that you read the news and literally those who speak there must say incredibly dumb, say simply dumb things, right? So that anyone, even a demented person, can understand. Because in part they fear to screw up in some ways, in other ways that they realize they have to offer something reliable, at least some static ground that somebody can say, at least that is as much as reliable as you can get, if you don't want to get in the nuisance of that. But if you are complaining just about journalism and you literally do not have any other form of expertise, and you don't go for it in an alternative, you are exactly the perfect success and target and accomplishment of those journalists, because those journalists want exclusively you to talk about what they said, and that's it, right? If what you do, I don't watch TV. Fundamentally, I can watch at best political commentaries by accident, but generally speaking, I am very dissatisfied. And I say it as a historian. Then there are people there that are political analysts. They're not historians. They know better, of course, some aspects rather than others. But most of that is a form of entertainment, right? If I want to know, say, what happens about the war in Ukraine, I just check, the info from a couple of essentially reliable and top centers of strategic analysis, and I go with that, and I discover things that are so deeply complex that just the average person does and will not understand, even if they read it. And the only reason why I managed to read it, which is not so complex, by the way, it's not that I think that I'm particularly intelligent or whatever. I'm not. I think my intelligence has always been kind of average, right? But I just was trained to work out large amounts of complex information as a living, and therefore I grasp kind of better the implications of that, which summed, okay, this was a military example, but say having studied the Funkrieg or having studied military history all my life, I can also relate to in great sense, even though I'm not an expert by any means. And I realize that it's my fault also to just rely on that, but if I were to reconstruct all the information that exists on the internet, I don't think any person can do that in the first place. And generally speaking, I form an opinion that, never basically diverges from what eventually is also going to happen, because great part of the reason why, as I was saying at the beginning, in history, it's not even about what happened, but what we can do about that as a knowledge, right? And so, in other words, to partially predict the future, right? Which we must necessarily try to do if we want to get anywhere. So, in that regard, I think you can also build some kind of you may not be an expert in a certain field, but still kind of understanding through the degree of complexity of the issues how insignificant most people's opinions are, right? And also, by the way, in that degree, how dumb, generally speaking, one side is. And it does turn out that the dumber you are, the more noisy you are, right? In other words, it is true that social networks very often bring out the worst of ourselves, because the person who doesn't suspect there to be something else and a lot of else out there would simply come out saying, the thing is like this, and plus they're, lying to us all because there's the terrible people who want to do something to us, that nothing happens obviously to them, and nobody understands why, at this point we would have not destroyed ourselves already, according to the delusions of these people. And you realize that from the other side, aside from some cheerleading that, oppositionally speaking, does happen, there is more decency, there is more silence, there is more let's wait and see, which is just per se as an attitude, kind of a wiser one, generally speaking. And also actually demonstrating that you don't have a lot of time to waste, because I don't know what kind of people go still on Facebook pages or YouTube videos making propaganda, leaving kind of denigratory messages, or hoping that their stupid comment over the billions that are posted every day has any actual consequence for literally the time that they have spent doing it, as opposed to what they could learn more and kind of more articulately express. Because of course it's just they are extremely cheap, short, dumb ideas, and even when they're more articulated, actually they're just a patch of data that remains uncritical, remains founded on, absolutely debatable premises, that is to say, which is most of the problem of it all, right? If you want to debunk like conspiracy theories or just cheap analysis, whatever, the easiest thing to do, even in a long text, is and you let it go because you don't even have the time to address that, right? Honestly, that's how after a while on social networks you just realize it's not worth it, because in order to debunk that thing, you could simply throw a bunch of phrases that will not be understood anyway, that you know to be actually reliable. If that person has never heard of them, they're wasting all the time just to write that bullshit. You know that they will never change idea publicly in that circumstance. Arguably, they could do that if they, they were countered. So there is also a sort of, why didn't you go against them? And of course, there is a way to also simply ridiculize these ideas, again, because spending too much criticism towards them is in that sense too costly. It's simply not worth it. It's to give these people more importance than the one that they actually have. That's in fact why I think this is typical of even a properly of decadent societies, that more people were able to express their ideas, but fundamentally these ideas began to just be insignificant. What's the point of a post or a comment or an incredibly uncritical and or short thing, and in the world mass of them all, even if people started seeing that there are all these bots around, that it's all kind of there is a war, that there are people who were absolutely impressed with that. They don't know what's going on, and so they can be easily bought over by these ideologies. Well, the most important thing is those who actually own power to be intelligent. Because I don't know if you noticed that, but if you do, again, as in traditional ways, if you are not able to do something, you will not accomplish it, right? And lying continuously and literally creating an entire national identity on paranoia, on, again, shouting to anything that happens abroad and in, kind of authoritarianism, is the proof of a lesser people, is the proof of a culture, of the inexistence of a culture. And this is not surprising when you study the history of those countries, because you know that simply there's never been such a thing there in the first place. So this is the destiny of most of the people that today complain that there is something terrible happening that nobody sees, which is correct as far as it's their collective inferiority that is making the basement kind of weakening, right? And of course, most of these people get consumed and recycled, so they're also useful by a degree, because they make the elites always aware of the fact that they must find solutions themselves. Otherwise, they would soften up themselves and they wouldn't be able to perform what they have to do. But if you live in the bubble of the lower grounds and nobody has showed you that there is an outer side or an above in the first place, you will never think that there is something wrong with you. Or at least you will actually feel that, but you will not be willing to rationalize it, and you will simply live the rest of your miserable existence without accomplishing anything. Again, this is exactly the story of the current generations. History is a cure to this, because history shows you, first of all, in those historical kind of by those historical standards that we have achieved scientifically by this point, that just immediately reading something from that, even if it could be criticized or whatever, that things are way more complex than they seem, right? It can take years sometimes. Yeah, I work, for example, like there are some basic essays, for example, that I had to study since the beginning of my my doctoral research that I founded, the latter of which was founded on. And I'm keeping to write in those essays because every time you read them, there may be, 60 pages, but every time you read them again, there is something, especially if they were written by clever people, always a they're extremely complex systems. Do you have the palest idea of what can a human brain express in 60 pages? If it's a very clever human, right? That every comma, every word, every implication of that statement has a place there. And when you write that yourself, you realize also how subtle and powerful and how much permeated in a spirit that concept really is, right? So when you read really good stuff, which is arguably hard to find in the truly good sense nowadays by a standard, but even if you read a book, right, just compared to whatever you can find on average on the internet nowadays, you will see evidently how more complex, insightful, open-minded, which literally means being able to the ability to literally grasp a certain knowledge and being able to integrate it in a comprehensive system of knowledge that you have already established, which in terms of reality checks is fundamental, because you cannot have developed a system of knowledge that is contrary to reality unless it's just a castle of cards, right? That's how most people think that they have the great theory behind them, that they're so intelligent, that because they have simply alienated themselves and never actually confronted themselves with reality. And how much this information can serve the purpose of simply giving you other indication to other things that you had no clue of, mostly. It's just like, again, when people tell me, oh, Schwerpunkt, thanks for making me listen to something that I didn't know I would be interested in. I mean, listening phrases like that is like, it makes my day in a sense. Naturally, it doesn't make my day because, my day, I think I would like to do tremendously more in my day, and that's unfortunately not enough. But let's say, makes me glad because it's exactly the first step to that kind of awareness. Right, finding time for learning history is not easy. Right, sometimes we have lots of other stuff to do. There can't just be this kind of, in fact, perpetual researchers always fixated on a certain information or whatever. But there are tricks. First of all, the most important thing is reading a bit of everything. Right, you can, yes, if you're interested in history, you should read a bit of everything within that realm. Right, and or that is also very vast. Like, I studied just and read mostly about military history for decades now. So anything, even if I'm a medievalist, I don't know, if I studied the Eastern Front during World War II, I get something, right, from it. I get, again, that there is a myriad of connections you can make comprehensively, knowing the countries, knowing the politics, knowing what people think or say today about that. Literally can help you teaching everything, right? That is an important thing, and it can be just a read every once in a while, especially again when you're young. Getting that basis of lots of things at a time, it's different things at a time. I mean, is really helpful, right? It gives you a dimension. Now, I will not digress specifically on the importance for military history, but the sense that, however, there must be a base from which you can move on, so that there is a hierarchy of knowledge that you have to gradually go down. That is very different from what you're habituated in a materialistic world, right? Say, as an engineer, for example, you can learn essentially physics, engineering. You basically get also in a world of realization, like you most of that, our job like that is getting the thing done, also as far as all the rules to get it done are concerned. There is a market, whatever. However, while you basically specialize in a certain field and you can grasp a lot of information from different other fields, it's likely when you're younger also to have more free time, because university, many people say, oh my god, I have to study a lot, and it is true, right? At some point, especially towards the end of the master, you really have a lot of work to do. you especially want to minimize any risk factor of losing time, because you're also looking forward to selections. You don't want to lose the opportunity and so on. The point, though, is that you can still really read something in the meanwhile, right? You're still forming, right? So even the possibility of, say, at that time, for example, I wouldn't start Schwerpunkt, and I realized today, of course, that say I developed over time. I wasn't ready when I began either, by some degree. At least, I've always told things that were satisfactorily acceptable, historically speaking, or sold. Like, I just could have added much more, not to be so simplistic in certain issues, right? Today I do address things in a bit of a different way. But up to that point, you must have learned something in the first place, and you're anxious to be anecdotal at that point. And that this is typical, again, of any person who wants to show off when they think that they know a lot, right? The two things is, either you do really know a lot by yourself, and there are people that I was, and I've never been actually, that really come up with an infused, ingrained knowledge of some sort. Maybe because they come from very intellectual families, or they really studied a lot. There is usually they're very brilliant at that point, but they tend also to be exactly within the establishment, in my opinion. I mean, they tend to just carve their niche there and to try to succeed in some other thing. I come from another background where I had to demonstrate for myself to be capable. Not because I came from disadvantaged backgrounds, or because I felt like that there was something specifically, for example, about my historical education lacking, that if I had not compensated, I would have been an outcast. Before I said that, that there is a complex of that kind, in the sense that the more intelligent and knowledgeable you are, and definitely more appealing you can be, especially if you choose a certain path. Then I educated myself with history at a completely different level that I didn't even know it was possible to achieve, and sometimes I didn't know that I could achieve it, even if I had tried. So that's yet an important thing. But in general, the sense that you have still to consolidate that knowledge, that to obtain a result in life, right, can be a very strong motivational force that in your youth is very present. In your youth, you're anxious. I mean, especially a male should be accomplished in his late 20s, by at least his late 20s, in a word or another, right? You never stop learning, but you realize at that point you should be trained to also produce, not to be taught, but to teach yourself, because you have acquired a knowledge that is satisfactory for that specific function. It is not easy, right? It is not easy at all. It's because these standards are quite high. The academia, after all, does have quite high levels of development, and there is also a sort of decadence, as I was telling you before, for which naturally who comes before realizes that younger people tend to be a bit more underperforming than what they were in the past, but they also themselves adapt to the realization that society is changing, and many people see that as a positive thing, like, okay, society changes, but we don't care that we actually register objectively kind of bad results, right? And you don't know, because again, I haven't gotten there yet. Let's see if I do, right? With time, at that time of somebody's life, and they're where you also start looking at your own life towards the end, and you can legitimately aim that what you did back in the day was much more than what kids do nowadays, because I have, let's say, it's a common idea. And I myself believe that literally there is an abyss between my generation. There is also a specific historical reason for this, and I agree with that. And I think it's a real thing scientifically. And say kids that, from the 2000s and so on, that literally have lost a lot, because also their teachers, their parents are people that from your past, and that they weren't that much, whereas the elderly ones, at least in the figures of teaching, were somehow better. You can sense that. So I can sense that, but at least, it may be a fact that in public institutions you don't want to argue, you don't want to insult people, you don't want to humiliate them. But to be completely frank, I think that, most people may properly see that, right? We saw that as students, to be fairly honest with ourselves, even when we were good, right? Or at least we succeeded in a way or another. But our teachers were, okay, well, this seems to be the case. They weren't particularly accusatory, right? And the only times I've heard such criticism and complaints from some cultural figures and stuff, sometimes they were pretty blind, I would say. I found some great, even great scholarly figures known in my country, abroad, whatever, that, came up with statements that, frankly, I thought were not great indicators. Like, for example, I don't know, that somebody talking in a bar normally is an idiot. And I think I surely talked about history in bars, right? And I don't think it was necessarily something negative, right? So a person that passes for a great intellectual says these things sounds like he was not even a posh person or one elite, top elite, but he was just a great thinker. And that everybody will remember for that, but that was not able to understand, for example, very much the potential of the internet, of the fact that there is a selection by means. People in many ways are also scared by technology in ways that I've never really understood, right? I don't understand how people can be concerned with technology per se, right? You should be concerned with people. Of course, you should be concerned with the tools they create, but as if technology was an intrinsic problem in itself, especially, say, you don't have to talk about nuclear weapons necessarily, but the internet. Right, of course, there are huge problems that did arise from the internet, and there's no doubt about this. But the question is, again, whose fault is that? The internet's or the people? Because if you think that humans are this innocent kind that, now had problems because the internet came about, and that the human nature is not able to deal with it. Really? You're not able to deal with the magic box with context and to say bullshit, right? Because that's literally what the internet is used for. Well, it may be actually a point, right, that people use it just for that, but in fact, those who actually work with that know how resourceful is this, and you would never do without that. It would be simply crazy to think to take it out. The problem is people. The problem is the pregress condition of people using the internet. Because if you're an idiot and use the internet, you use it as an idiot. And maybe there could also be the chance of being a bit less of an idiot, as it happened to all of us, right? How many times we learned something from the internet, not having seen what the word was out there about certain things, and saying, you know what, I aged, I manned up ever since I've learned that thing. And sure, I may be influenced and become lazy or such, but that is on me, right? It's not on the mean, right? This, again, rampant materialism and anti-spirituality is that we're going through it. Everything becomes a material problem, not people's fault, is quite disturbing. So a bit goes for history, right? Reading, I don't know, listening to music. Like, I was just reflecting on that recently. Right? What is the utter privilege to be able to listen to musical compositions from hundreds of years ago and realizing that they can never be replicated in the way they were. And if not on their own basis, like even artificial intelligence, all these issues for ChatGPT. It's how can you be impressed by something like that? Of course, you should immediately sanction it and shut it down, as of course it's happening exactly in these days everywhere, because it finds out personal data and manages to disseminate it for scamming and even worse purposes. There is no doubt that that's dangerous. But how can you be scared by a machine that is being created by men just to do exactly what men told the machine to do? That is to say, much less than what a person can do. Who the hell cares to read a mock text written in the style of King James Bible? I mean, even if you created thousands of other patterns there, we will start writing history books with stuff picked from the internet. It's still from the internet. The question is, why should we have only that artificial intelligence and not a better one programmed to express a better historical judgment? Where do you get the reliability over the historical judgment? Yes, it's possible that we will shipwreck towards kind of just what an artificial intelligent interpretation of history will be, as opposed to to what we do today, which it may be still imperfect by a degree, but the question is, who will set that knowledge? Okay, they will fish that information, but then we realize, okay, the thing is in its infancy, it's dumb. It says pretty stupid things, as a matter of fact. It's dramatically incorrect things. It simply doesn't understand math or physics or whatever. But again, what's even our limit in that? I mean, we are the humans programming it, right? So we learn along the way, but the knowledge that we acquire in order to program the thing on the base of that information is still the point of it all, right? If information which is based on reality starts being fished, let's say selected with a criterion that is wrong, still it will not match up reality, and there will always be a teacher that will tell students essentially what history is about. The greatest problem is not artificial intelligence, it's human intelligence, or lack thereof, right? And not because it will be replaced by an artificial one, necessarily, but because simply what can happen in somebody's mind can be very wrong without even realizing it, right? And that's the thing that scares me. It's not it's not the mean, it's the end. It's how people start to properly prioritize things and how that doesn't practically match with reality. And the interesting thing about this is, I think, there may actually be a much more advanced reality assessment through this, because if people start becoming so reliant on such stuff, the degree of control that we will have to extend on, let's say, the way such huge systems now of global scale really work will necessarily must be ever more developed and advanced. And this, again, derives primarily from a human awareness. It doesn't derive from somebody who sorted out the thing for you, right? At least I strongly don't believe it. There are actually much more cogent reasons for believing that things will just remain the same. We've been fooled, of course, by technologists that want to sell just their garbage all the time without any actual degree of application in the real world. But there is a much more complex, sophisticated, and refined system that is humanity, as imperfect as it is, that simply, in order to stay under such thing, would have to just be rigidly kept together for reasons that we still don't see which one they could be. Again, no problem that artificial intelligence can become a threat. It can become a threat when it's weaponized by humans. It's a completely different thing than the Skynet scenario, right? And it's actually much more disturbing. With some possibilities, however, of, let's say, some pros that include the actual necessity of some sort of stability. And again, can go towards the over-reliance on certain technologies, but also necessarily on something that is done by ever greater security standards, which is true also for the actually much more destructive powers that we handle, energetically, militarily, and so on. So history, in this sense, gives you the confidence to appreciate this capacity, right? History poses you in front, after all, the realization that humanity is the protagonist of the entire thing. It is true that history, its historiography in the last generations has tended to divert the attention from it, has begun to start talking in a more superstitious way, where things happen because there are some greater given factors that you can play with, but that you cannot erase practically, and that basically dictate human history just a bit by themselves, right? When you study, unsurprisingly, more specialistic history, you realize that things are much more mentally and kind of, free will based, that humanity is able to fuck up things very well on its own, without climate change, without any kind of strange phenomenon that intervenes from the outer side, about which climate change, of course, we don't know even the degree by which what we're doing is happening, nor we are in the very infancy of understanding anything about this planet's climate, which actually makes you see things in a much different perspective, and this is not a mystery among the specialists in this field. In any case, there are, again, much greater problems than the ones you are essentially imposed on, because they, as I was saying at the beginning, they responsibilize you, right? If you say that there is some overall greed that is causing a major change, and that the common people, the poor people, that are not interested in these terrible wars, that they're happening just because, again, of this single evil people, that as if all the other people didn't have any decision on that, and as if it doesn't make a difference between the people who fight wars. It's only bad because they fight wars, right? And surprise, very often you just want to destroy civilization in the process, meaning siding with a bad guy because you hate yourself and your own civilization, and you cannot stand again the fact that you are already to the degree of disgust that you are. And so it's easy because it's not like a single person that you have to say it's your fault. It's just a generic thing that naturally also starts from the fact that you do not know anything about politics or history or whatever responsibility, why people do the way they do and how they do that and why and so on. It's just you who wants to pretend to be innocent, because deep inside you perfectly know that you're the most culpable person ever, right? And I say this again because I truly believe that socialistic people and nationalistic peoples are the same. People are the same. You can have, say, climate change fanatics who truly think, I don't know, that the United States is evil and that wants to establish a terrible world order, and that there are all the peoples in the world now rebelling and being able to create an alternative order of peaceful people that want just to interact freely and peacefully. If you think this, there is something severely wrong happened in your households. You didn't have adequate parental figures, you didn't have an adequate education, and you're just on the way. You surely are already say displaying some traits of mental disorder, as they are extremely common today, and you're just going downhill. Sorry for you, but you deserve it, right, for being yourself in the current state. So it can go the other way around, right? There are, the opposites that are true, and whatever. The only thing that surprises me is, again, that how far you can measure the fact that, say, in the second half of the 20th century we improved, at least from, still the standards were pretty low, but we improved. Right now you can measure the degree of the collapse. Now it's normal, we would know this would happen, right? The rest of the world never even knew what the West knew in the second half of the 20th century, and it will collapse even in a much harsher way. Look at socioeconomic kind of indicators of countries like China or Russia, and we'll talk about it later because the thing will happen anyway. And that's why they also realize it's their last shot to have any kind of margin for the future, because that's literally a survival thing for their incompetence, naturally, because they weren't, countries emerging from communism, of course, are hardly to be, attributed any kind of dignity in the first place as peoples properly. But the entire, these are the consequences, right? There is not much way around that. But in any case, you see, history helps you not just in, say, explaining things, but simply knowing how they happened, right? Which is the most interesting thing. I mean, in order to express certain judgments, like in the reason why people are phobic and paranoid and about also being personally judged is mostly stemming from this. It's from the fact that they don't want to stand the test of evidence, right? The test of data. And very often, since, as I was saying before, this attitude comes from incredibly weak theories. Sometimes if they're truly paranoid and truly narcissistic, etc., they cannot accept that. They become aggressive, passive-aggressive. They shut down their prefrontal cortex. They just go wild, ignoring any data. But the others should actually be pretty easy to convince otherwise, right? Arguably, it's very difficult, especially if you are already, most of these people's problems start from very early on. I mean, just banally, if by 4 years old you have not been properly taught by your parents and habituated to just being quiet and, not handling yourself, not making noise in public places, not disturbing people, knowing how to just to be tranquil, you're fucked up as a person. Like, you will grow unconfident with people around you that will hate you because you're just a spoiled brat, and you cannot fix this practically. You will have at best severe psychological problems when you will be an adult, and certain things at that point will not be able to be fixed. But let's say if there is still a good chance for you because you come from a quasi-normal family, you may at least be set on the grounds of making anything like another family and children work without dramatic problems. I mean, it may be wishful thinking again, because it's not the only thing it takes, unfortunately, but at least you can reason on something, right? And I cannot see here anything outside of family, first of all, and secondarily of school, that must do that work. If you miss that, like if by 18 years old you're an idiot, you remain an idiot for the rest of your life, right? There is those people, those documentaries that show, this person was, I don't know, a political fanatic for all his life, then he met that person and changed his mind, and now he's all about, Jesus and forgiveness, and then they're just destroyed people that will not be practically useful, if not, again, as cheap labor. And we have to think in these terms, because that's how most people will turn to. How do we discipline this cheap labor? How do we distribute it? How do we keep these people in society and use them? This is an important question that, will be answered by facts, meaning that you already see essentially this kind of serf kind of lifestyle where you already depend on some major feudal lord. can be a big company or whatever that exploits your misery as you decided to be in it. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, except it's not a positive thing in absolute terms that person is in that state. And if you dig into that, you will realize that it's mostly their fault. Right? There are some systems that are arguably already screwed up, but the point is that they're not screwed up because of debt, of money, or whatever. They're screwed up because they're screwed up morally. And until one understands this, there won't be any solution to the problem. And morality is learned, is taught, whatever different stages we're talking about, but it must derive from a shared, reliable, moral, scientific standard that, again, first of all, a truly satisfactory education, not the average school that people go to, but not even saying that, I don't know, private schools are better. This has nothing to do with that. This is about, there are no jokes here. It has to be actually good. And primarily, again, with a family that supports you and really shows you what is right and what is wrong, because there is such a thing, right? And that must be learned in turn, because it's not just saying that, but being able to spot what is right and what is wrong. Right? If you don't start from the realization that there is a single truth, you cannot have this in the first place. And the single truth doesn't mean that you know the truth, right? But that you're able to discriminate between that, because incidentally, what people think that the truth is those that do not properly accept that there is a truth at all. Right, this is also very interesting, right? When you say, I don't think opinions can always be different, people will always, yeah, okay, but what does this tell us about whether an opinion is better than another? Say, I don't believe in absolute truth. Okay, then I think this about that. What do you think? No, it's not true. Okay, so what the fuck do you know if you don't know what the truth is? It happens all the freaking time. You can immediately spot that that's also a mental disorder. I'm sure it will be framed at some point that ignorance, severe ignorance, will be at least say both cause and symptom of mental disorders, right? And a huge deal of mental disorders do stem from that, because it means not to have a root, a background. So when you go on in life, hopefully, if you have really consolidated a good historical awareness by this all this reading and all this interest and so on over time, you should also be able to put that to fruit. And of course, you can do lots of things. Hopefully, you can just be in the field. Otherwise, you can be, just do I don't know, like things I do. Here next to the previous ones. You can be also more out there, you can be writing books, you can be a public figure, whatever, I don't know. The point at that point is it over? Like, did we study all that much during our youth? To do what exactly? Just to make money? That is satisfying, I understand that. That's important. You should be able to succeed in that way. The problem, though, is when is that you can draw the line, especially with history, between, okay, I've stopped learning and continuing to learn, right? Rarely I've seen people who dedicate their entire life to continuous learning, in parallel, again, to other activities, maybe just in their work as well. I mean, as I often say, Schwerpunkt helps me dramatically with things I do for a living, let's say. And without that, I would have not understood so much. But this naturally required also a huge effort, a huge commitment. Why do I do this? Of course, it's because I hope I can succeed in bringing the channel forward and all this stuff. But if it were just for what I learned so far, by discussing these things, preparing, making history videos, all this stuff, I would keep it. even if I hadn't earned anything, or, considering all the time that I committed to it, to me, it was well spent. It's not just well spent, but it improves and it keeps improving. And this is the beauty of history in many ways, that the level of improvement never truly ceases, right? This is true for any knowledge, but history is also, as we've seen, provocative as far as especially that you are able to dimension all the political and military and social issues that historically happened. That you will naturally never be able to finish in your lifetime. As I was saying before, 12,000 now books, history books, plus others that I actually have in addition to them. I already know I will not live enough to read them all, right? And when I look at them, because I know them one by one, my question is, I know that there is a lot of knowledge there. And if I knew, even if I read all these books realistically, and I've read really a lot of them so far already, but it would be fantastic. I would get to a level of knowledge probably nobody has ever reached, because, again, I also work with them. It's not a matter of reading them. You can have read easily even more than these at some point. If you say, making simple math, let's say, how many can you read? How many years can you read a book per day? Let's say 32 years. Okay, it's perhaps not that easy to read as much. But let's say you have a structure. That's why the formative part is crucial. To get, and this is what really these books serve to me now, all that information already sorted out by a criterion, a method, an order that you have developed within, and that nobody can. There is no app, there is no program, there is nothing to make it work but yourself. And it's extremely efficient. And the beauty of it is that the more you learn, the more efficient it becomes. And it's extremely powerful. It's more powerful than any artificial intelligence is ever able to perform. Because it has nothing to do with just picking some random patterns that you don't even know how to spend practically. This has to do with exactly knowing where all the stuff that you may have that you need at this moment may be in, and how you could get it, and how far, by just commenting and thinking about it for a few times, you can build in terms of original content. For example, I essentially make original content. I obviously base myself on books, on articles, on anything. Like, sometimes I'm able to talk for hours. Say, if you give me a medieval history manual, I can simply, talk forever just about the broader pattern. Then, of course, I can learn many other things, and I can, in the sense, say, expand on topics that I wouldn't know before. And I would also forget over time. Of course, all the information is stored, but the important thing is that all what I can elaborate on at the moment is original. Do you realize what this means? It may be, I don't know, cheap. It may not be, again, what an artificial intelligence can elaborate just if you give them some pattern, right? But the capacity to understand whether that artificial intelligence is saying something useful or not, you will not practically be able to get from any intelligence. You will not be able to profitably criticize that. You will not be able to essentially explain why a mistake is a mistake, for example, which a human can do. Right? It happens to, for example, say one word for another. And to immediately say, look, this was a word for another, it doesn't sound, shouldn't be there, whatever, but you can understand exactly where you fucked up and how, and you can fix that, and you can point out tons of other things about why that happened. Artificial intelligence cannot do that, right? It can't guess, it can't just be habituated to go back to a previous model that will essentially just rhetorically tell him to excuse itself for some kind of odd reason, and that it won't practically get anywhere by itself. The degree of original work, for example, that I uploaded here, cannot be provided with the level of human-to-human functionality, right? In order to make a person understand or to make a point that that a machine could do. A machine will never tell you that our standards are disgusting, right? Because first of all, it's not being programmed to do that. Secondly, it will not arrive to it by itself. We do not have that capacity yet. It's just a great fisher, right? And a paster and copier, and that's copist. That's basically it, right? There is hardly any other mechanism behind it, or it's all, pretty randomly and easily creatable, right? Without too much problem. As try to make what we explained here. It's a completely different issue. Now, when you arrive to that point at which you should be able to produce yourself, reading becomes more difficult because you have first of all to work in order to achieve the latter. It is true that work still comes, as we've seen, through picking this information, elaborating it, creating parallelisms, etc. Right? However, a great part of this also depends on the realization that you cannot quite, first of all, cover everything, and that you have simply to give a price to what you're doing. Learning further is an heroic enterprise that is actually difficult, very difficult to be up to in a general sense, right? And it could simply waste your life, because if you don't earn anything, let's suppose, how can you go on with that? There are ways and ways, right? I'm not saying to go for just an ascetic life and in a cave or whatever, because that wouldn't necessarily explain why that would be better than doing something else, right? And to someone who was essentially trying just to make things work for others, right? That's just an involution. That's just like, I'm not able to do it, so I'm measuring my limits as a person, and I give up. Or I want to be reassured by my condition, rather than let's say being protecting myself in front of this pain, practically, rather than helping others or thinking about this rotten world, after all, has not given me anything. The doctrine of struggle and victory instead pushes in a completely different direction, and it has naturally to do with the degree you're willing to succeed in anything. That can be also attained in theory, even if you decided to be a hermit, right? But that not necessarily will have, even if it comes actually from such a realization that you can't do enough, just by its own admission, it cannot practically work, right? The important aspect of this story is also that it's hard to maintain, say, to pretend that there is not a limit when de facto you're not up to it, right? So learning history continuously should also leave ground to some sort of, hopefully, of continuity in, for example, to a family. It should be about teaching someone else what you have learned so far, and realizing that likely, even if you can try your best, you will not necessarily be able to accomplish the mission. The sense here is that power, say, what you have learned could be the trampoline for some kind of other growth, some kind of other exploit that you can put up if you are willing enough, let's say, to bring things to another level. If you think you have become so good at what you do that your broader insight will not get to just stop to a single place and say, okay, I will remain here until I die, and you can't think to make it to a broader, to a higher level, well, just go for it, right? It may seem kind of, again, heroic. You must make some compromise eventually with that. The point, though, is that, in my opinion, is worth doing, because if you think you truly have something to say, this can happen. Maybe even you become a university professor, and maybe you will affect how people think. But there is an upper struggle, right? How many times you have heard a university professor becoming dramatically controversial and trying to change the world with his thoughts? It does happen. Actually, I know you have one specific name in mind, because most of my followers surely follow him too. I'm not entirely satisfied with him telling the truth, and I also explain in some videos why that is not the case, because even there is the sort of a accommodation, right, in a stop of the improvement in many ways, a stop of properly a limit in the simply even not being able to tell what tradition arrives to, even when it's actually it should be very evident, at least for someone who makes some conservative points and at least hints at kind of a traditional meaning coming from some specific sources that, however, he does not really investigate. In that case, it may be because he's not an expert, who's not entered properly in a historical mindset. But it's obvious enough that things hardly ever reach kind of a higher point, the higher point of literal control over the world. It takes discipline, right? The interesting thing is that if somebody doesn't do it, somebody else less qualified will do it for you. And there is the idea that politics is too complicated sometimes, which is true, and you also have to be extremely competent in that too, and it's not easy, right? Good politicians should be, in theory, able to provide that kind of comprehensive knowledge of the world and that kind of know-how, but also properly of wisdom that it takes to rule, given all what this entails. However, history, in my opinion, is the only way. Like, all great rulers are fixated with history in a way or another. They were after some model or not. Some would really fail, and badly, because of course they are not up to them, but also they are not up to them because they do not have a complete historical understanding. So they will just lament themselves of the fact that eventually the picture they had in their head doesn't match with reality. Well, that's where you fail, and you cannot continue to pretend that what you're doing is not a failure. And a bad one, right? That's what history teaches you. Because if the degree of misunderstanding is what we see today, where you have massive defeats, and people still think that there is some good in that, just because they don't really get what it's at stake, well, it's a bit difficult to have any other standard as a person. So the time to learn history is never over. Is never, like, I finished this book, so I know more or less all what I have to know about the whole thing. There's always an ulterior knowledge that you can get to, and that will eventually emerge if you are trying to rely on historical knowledge that, however, is not present, because you essentially misunderstood what was going on. Right? So, my horizons have to do mostly with this concept, because it's very difficult to presume that, let's say, even to make a successful difference or something. But if you're just abiding to the rules in a moment which you know that you have limited options, limited time especially, you may be missing more than you think. It's always risky. We're all sinners. We're all, let's say, imperfect indeed, and quite so, right? It's not just like a person is normal. Every person is normal. It's just maybe a preference over. No, we're significantly rigged, right? The average person, as we were saying before, just doesn't. It's under everybody's eyes. We can't be nice about it or about ourselves, but we do have this faults, and again, we perfectly know which ones they are. So trying to fool ourselves and other people into thinking that it's not the case because we think that things will go well for us, just because we see that objectively it's difficult to get things done well, and so we want to pretend to skip that as if that reality did not exist, will never end well. Never. Right? And I believe that there is naturally a great room for further insight in this thing, because I'm just seeing right now, frankly, because I do other stuff when I'm talking. That's also why towards the end I slow down. It's not just that I'm tired for talking for hours, it's just that the patterns, right, of this collapse are very evident, right? The patterns of what works and what doesn't work is very evident. Again, the problem is make it see it to another person, which is instead, which is really a challenge, especially the person who doesn't know that, who doesn't see or sees that, but it doesn't have the tool to understand that. It's a challenge, right? I try to set examples to, to try to be up to some standards that are at least always above what I find to be the average. It's really difficult, right? I can't say it's I succeed particularly, but let's say making one step longer than your leg may end up in significant issues by some degree, but it could easily also help you to arrange something more powerful if you succeed, especially if these steps, are not really your entire leg, but say, it's really a smaller game, but from that you can nurture some bigger games. In any case, for today, stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.